If you grew up near the Appalachian Mountains, you already know. Folks don't just make up stories out here, they remember them. I'd love to know, where are you tuning in from and what time is it right now? Drop it in the comments. It's wild how many of us are sitting in the dark, listening to the same story, scattered across different corners of the country. Hit the like button and subscribe. It helps more people find their way into these woods, whether they should or not. Let's start. I was 32 the summer they finally finished paving the Pine Hollow spur. For most of my life, it had been a muddy, potholed access road curling off Route 9 toward the old forestry station. People in town called it the Spine, because driving it felt like rattling over vertebrae. Nobody had touched it in decades, and most maps didn't even bother showing it anymore. But last spring, the county announced a grant for recreational infrastructure, which sounded like a joke until fresh asphalt started appearing in the middle of nowhere. By late August, the road was as smooth as a bowling lane, dark and gleaming, with brand new guardrails that looked absurd against the scrubby hollows and leaning pines. I'd been following the work all summer from my post at the volunteer firehouse. I'm a substitute teacher most of the year, but in the off months I help with fire calls and brush burns. That night I'd finished a 12-hour shift training rookies on the new water pump. My arms were heavy, my brain buzzing from too much instant coffee. The idea of sitting at home in my stuffy apartment above the auto parts store felt unbearable. I wanted air and quiet. My truck keys were already in my hand before I realized where I was going. Partly I was curious about the road. Small town. Gossip said the new pavement led right past the shuttered forestry station and straight to the Green Rock trailhead. I'd hiked that trail years ago in college when it was still just a deer path. It felt like a good excuse to see how things had changed. Dusk was bleeding out of the sky as I turned off Route 9. The fresh pavement felt unnatural under my tires, like skating across a frozen pond after months of mud. The truck hummed instead of rattled. Even the ditches looked manicured, lined with crushed limestone instead of weeds. I rolled the windows down. Pine needles were damp with the day's rain, and the air smelled faintly metallic, like wet nails. My headlights bounced off mile markers I'd never seen before. White plastic posts with reflective green numbers. Whoever laid this out wanted people to find something. Past mile marker 3, the forest pressed closer. Old hemlocks arched overhead, knitting together until the road tunneled beneath them. That was when I noticed the tracks, 2 sets of wide treads slicing off the asphalt into the gravel shoulder. They curved toward the forestry station's chain-link fence, except the fence wasn't upright anymore. The gate sagged crooked, padlock sheared clean off. A strip of reflective tape fluttered from the latch like a torn caution flag. I slowed, cut my engine, and listened. The woods were too quiet for evening, no katydids, no trickle from the creek. I thought of what my old mentor at the firehouse used to say about silent woods. When it's that still, something's looking at you. My first impulse was to keep driving, but boredom, or maybe some dumb civic reflex, made me pull onto the shoulder. The gravel popped under my tires like distant gunfire. I grabbed the heavy flashlight we keep for brush fires and stepped out. Up close, the gate looked almost surgically opened. Not ripped, not pried. Cut. The fence's diamond pattern curled inward in a clean flap, like someone had traced it with a giant can opener. Inside the perimeter, the old forestry station squatted in the gloom. Its cinder block walls were stained black from years of rain. The windows were boarded with warped plywood scrawled with graffiti, so old the names had blurred into shadows. I remembered sneaking here in high school for beers and dares. Back then, the place had felt haunted but empty. Now it felt expectant. I slipped through the opening, my boots sinking into flattened weeds. No fresh footprints, no cigarette butts, just those tire tracks vanishing around the back of the building. My flashlight beam jittered as I moved. The building's main door was ajar, held by a splintered deadbolt. A faint chemical tang wafted out, something sharp and sweet like varnish. My throat tightened. Inside it was colder than the night air. The plywood killed the light so completely that my flashlight seemed swallowed. Cinder block walls stretched, higher than I remembered, lined with bolted steel shelving. Most shelves were bare except for heaps of busted junk, rusted fire extinguishers, collapsed cardboard boxes, old spools of wire. But near the far wall, something stood out. A row of canvas tarps folded into neat rectangles. Their edges were squared like military bedding, not like anything a drunk teenager would leave. I crouched, aiming the beam low. The floor beneath the tarps was different. Newer concrete, paler than the rest, scored with faint hairline cracks. I thought about backing out and calling someone, but the longer I stared, the more the tarps felt like an invitation. My gloved hand brushed one edge. It shifted, exposing an iron ring set flush into the slab. The ring turned with surprising ease. A square hatch lifted, exhaling a puff of cool, stale air. Beneath yawned a pit, about 5 feet deep. My beam swung across bare walls, then caught on boxes arranged in 2 rows, each identical in size, spaced like chess pieces, not milk crates. Wooden chests, hand-built, sanded smooth. Their lids were simple planks secured by latches so shiny they flashed under my light. My heartbeat thrummed in my ears. I lowered myself onto the ladder rung set into the pit wall. The concrete smelled of old earth and bleach. The first chest opened with barely a squeak. Inside lay a child's raincoat, neatly folded, patterned with faded dinosaurs. Beneath it, tiny shoes wrapped in plastic. A laminated badge clipped to the collar. Camp Green Rock, July 1998. My breath came shallow. I lifted another lid. A small sleeping bag, a cracked flashlight, a hand-drawn map of the trailhead with a smiley face in one corner. Everything was arranged like an exhibit, like someone had wanted these things preserved. I don't know how long I knelt there, opening lids, recognizing fragments of other people's summers. Then a sound reached me. Not the scuttle of mice or drip of water, but a low, rhythmic shudder, fabric dragging across stone. It was coming from above, near the shelving. I froze. The light trembled in my grip, spraying arcs across the pit walls. The sound paused, then resumed, slower this time, as if whoever, or whatever, knew I was listening. I climbed out fast, scraping my knee on the hatch edge. My boots landed on the concrete with a hollow thud. "Hello?" My voice cracked in the darkness. "This is county property. Who's in here?" Only the stillness answered. My beam swept the shelves. Nothing moved, yet the chemical smell was stronger now, sweet and cloying, like sap boiled down to tar. My head buzzed. For a heartbeat, I thought I saw shapes behind the plywood. Tall, thin silhouettes pressed against the boards like insects under glass. I took a step backward. That was when a pale hand curled into the beam. A child's hand, fingers gray with dust. Then retreated behind a stack of buckets. I lunged for the doorway, my flashlight bouncing off the walls. My boots snagged on the weeds as I bolted through the gate, lungs heaving. The woods outside felt just as silent, but the darkness had a texture now, like velvet stretched too tight. My truck's dome light glowed ahead. I fumbled inside, slammed the locks, and sat clutching the wheel. My heart refused to slow. After a minute, I thumbed 911. The dispatcher's voice was flat until I mentioned the chests and the name tags. Then her tone snapped taut. "Stay where you are," she said. "A unit is on its way." Her words carried an edge not of alarm, but of inevitability, like she'd rehearsed them. 15 minutes crawled by. Headlights appeared, throwing long bones of light across the trees. A sheriff's SUV rolled up and stopped facing the building. The driver stayed inside for a while, engine idling. When he did emerge, he moved slowly, eyes fixed on the forestry station as though it might lunge. He was older, uniform rumpled, expression unreadable. "You the caller?" he asked without looking at me. "Yes," I managed. There's stuff down there, boxes, kids' things." He nodded once as if I'd confirmed something. "Did you go all the way in?" His voice was soft, almost pitying. I opened a few boxes. There was a hand. My throat closed. He finally looked at me. His pupils were pinpoints in the cruiser's glare. "Get back in your truck," he said. "We'll handle it from here." He didn't ask for ID, didn't even write anything down. Just waved me off like a man shooing a stray dog. I drove away without checking the mirror until I hit Route 9. When I finally glanced back, his SUV was still parked at the gate, headlights burning into the doorway. Something pale flickered in the beam. Maybe mist, maybe movement. The radio in my cab crackled, though it wasn't on. For a moment I swore I heard children singing, a thin, off-key chorus. Then it cut out. They closed Pine Hollow Spur a week later, citing unstable subgrade. New barriers appeared overnight. The local paper printed nothing. People at the firehouse wouldn't meet my eyes when I mentioned it. One rookie muttered something about hollow children, an old mountain story I'd half forgotten. Supposedly in the 1930s, a flood wiped out a summer camp near Green Rock. The kids who drowned were said to linger in the ravines, collecting what was lost and waiting for someone to return it. I'd always laughed at that kind of folklore. Now it sits in the back of my skull like a splinter. Most nights I manage to forget, but sometimes when the wind dies and the pines go still, I hear that faint dragging sound again, fabric over stone, and I wonder if it really belonged to a person, or if the hollow children were folding their keepsakes, readying a new crate. I started running courier jobs out of Laurel Gap, a tired little Appalachian town that clung to the ridges like moss. The pay was lousy, but it kept my gas tank half full and gave me a reason to drive the backroads I grew up avoiding. Most of the time, I ferried small packages between shops, the kind of errands nobody else wanted. That morning, I had a box wrapped in brown paper and a deadline pinned against noon. My boss at the depot had warned me not to screw it up again. One more late delivery, and I'd be off the roster. That was the only reason I even considered cutting through the path by the old mission hall. It wasn't really a chapel, not anymore. Folks around here called it the Bethel Mission, though it hadn't been listed in any county records for 50 years. My grandfather used to mutter about the place when he was drunk, saying it drank more souls than it saved. As a kid, I thought he meant gambling or whiskey. Later I learned he meant something stranger. People said the last minister there had been a woman who wandered the hollows preaching about angels that lived under the mountain. One night she took the entire youth choir down into the cellar and bolted the doors. None of them came back out. The building was condemned, the doors nailed, but nobody ever tore it down. I never liked passing near it. Even in daylight, the trees seemed to bend toward the roof, leaning in like gossiping neighbors. But the highway was blocked by construction crews that morning, and if I wanted to make my delivery, I had to shave off time. The shortcut meant threading right past the sagging mission hall and climbing the ridge on its far side. My mutt, Boone, rode in the passenger seat with his nose out the window. He was usually fearless, the type to bark at coal trucks 3 times his size. When we reached the gravel pull-off, Boone's head whipped back inside. He started whining low in his throat, a sound I'd never heard from him. My tires crunched over weeds that had cracked through the pavement. I killed the engine. The mission hall sat at the lot's edge, its roof bowed like a spine on the verge of snapping. The boards across the double doors were warped and half fallen, leaving gaps wide enough to see dark slats behind. I told myself Boone was overreacting to a groundhog. Still, I hesitated. The parcel sat on the seat beside me, corners smudged with sweat from my palms. I kept thinking about the deadline. If I turned around, I'd have to circle 20 miles the long way. Boone jumped down before I could stop him. His paws rustled the tall grass, claws clicking on what was left of the old sidewalk. He froze at the bottom step. His whole body went rigid, tail down, ears tight against his skull. I followed his gaze toward the doorway. At first, nothing moved. Then one of the planks shifted outward with a slow, reluctant creak, like something inside was pushing against it. The air thickened. That's the only way I can explain it. Breathing felt like dragging syrup through my lungs. Beneath the must of creek water and mildew, a sweet sour rot seeped out, clinging to the back of my tongue. Boone whimpered, a raw, human-sounding noise that made my neck prickle. The boards bowed farther, For a moment, I thought the whole structure would collapse. Instead, a shape stepped through the gap. It wasn't a man. It wasn't even the outline of one. The thing stooped as it emerged, too tall for the frame. Its shoulders tapered sharp like a broken yoke. The arms hung long, ending in wrists that looked hinged wrong. What passed for a head bent forward, as though it had grown tired of carrying its own weight. I wanted to back away. My knees wouldn't move. Boone pressed himself against my leg, ribs fluttering under his fur. The figure stopped at the top step. The silence rang so hard my ears buzzed. Then it scraped one hand across the porch rail. The sleeve hung open, and I glimpsed something pale inside. Not flesh, but polished bone gleaming like driftwood. The hand uncurled with delicate patience. It lifted its palm and beckoned. That was when the voice came. It didn't echo. It just folded itself into the air, soft and calm, as though it had been waiting for me specifically. "Too late," it murmured. The words seeped through the boards, not from the thing's blank face, but from the doorway behind it. I looked at the parcel in my hands. The paper felt damp, though the morning was dry. Something inside shifted with a weight I hadn't noticed before. "Bring it," the voice said. My chest hurt from how hard my heart pounded. Boone growled once, sharp enough to sting my ears. It was the jolt I needed. I staggered backward, my heel catching in the ruts. The parcel slipped from my grip. It hit the ground with a muffled thump. I heard something inside roll, heavier than it should have been for a box that small. The figure stepped down. As its feet touched the grass, the blades curled inward, bleaching to brittle yellow in rings that spread outward like spilled acid. Boone barked then, loud, frantic, and darted toward the fence. I scrambled after him, my breath ragged, my legs shaking so hard I barely cleared the wire. Behind me, the boards seemed to sigh, as if the building itself exhaled relief at letting its tenant out. I landed hard on the other side, pain bursting through my ankle. The world tilted, but adrenaline dragged me forward. Boone was already on the road, claws sparking against gravel. I crawled until my knees hit asphalt. I dared one glance back. The mission hall looked exactly as it always had. Roof sagging, doors shut tight, boards nailed across. No sign of the figure. No sign of the parcel. Only the grass, patchy and yellowed in rings that hadn't been there before. I lay on the road until the burning in my chest dulled. Boone circled back, whining, nudging my cheek with his nose. Eventually, I limped to the truck, ankle throbbing. By the time we reached town, the sun had slid higher, but everything felt dimmer, like the hours had stretched longer than they should. I didn't deliver the parcel. I couldn't even explain why. My supervisor screamed at me the next day, threatened to dock my pay, but I kept my mouth shut. How do you tell someone you were stopped by something that wasn't supposed to exist? I tried not to think about it until a week later, when Boone refused to leave the apartment. He paced the doorway, growling at nothing I could see. That night, lying in bed, I heard a dragging scrape under the floorboards. The same slow test of claws I'd heard on the porch rail. When I pressed my ear to the wood, I thought I heard the faintest whisper. Too late. I've never gone near Bethel Mission again. The highway crew finished their repairs, so I don't need the shortcut. But every so often, when I pass the ridge, I look toward the tree line. The boards are still there, nailed across the door, but sometimes the grass in front is dead in fresh rings, and I know something is still stepping out when no one's watching. And I wonder if the parcel was ever meant to be delivered, or if I had been the one expected all along. I was 27 when it happened, working part-time for the Historical Society in a town that most maps leave as a dot. My job was to digitize old deeds and surveyor notes for an Appalachian land grant project. The pay was barely enough to cover gas, but I figured it would look good on a resume. Mostly, though, I took it because I liked the quiet. I thought sitting in a courthouse basement, hunched over paper that smelled like mold and dust, would be safer than the chaos of other jobs I'd tried. I had no idea how wrong I was. That October morning, the air was sharp enough to sting. I parked my hatchback outside the Clay County Courthouse Annex, a squat stone building wedged against the base of Buckhorn Ridge. The main courthouse sat up on the hill, like some grand old judge's house. But the annex was where they shoved anything not important enough to polish. Inside was a half-finished renovation project. Fluorescent lights buzzing over yellowed walls, the floor patched with mismatched tiles. The stairs to the archive room descended into a pocket of cold that never seemed to lift. My assignment that week was a box of survey maps that hadn't been touched since the 1940s. The clerk upstairs, Mrs. Avery, was the type who knew every family name for 5 counties. But she shoved the box across the counter without comment, as if she didn't want her hands on it. The archive room itself was barely bigger than a school library. Tall cabinets loomed along the walls, their metal handles icy to the touch. I slid the box onto a scarred oak table, uncapped my thermos, and told myself I could get through a dozen files before lunch. The first maps were what I expected. Faded ink lines showing hollows and streams. Notations about acreage, initials of long-dead surveyors. But after 30 minutes, I noticed something off. Parcel after parcel was marked under the same number, Lot 112C. The dates stretched across decades, each signed by a different hand. Families changed, ownership shifted, but the land designation never moved. Even the handwriting varied. Curled flourishes, jagged block letters, some pressed so hard they cut into the paper. Still, that one number repeated like a chant. 112C, 112C, 112C. I tried to laugh it off as some clerical quirk, but a weight settled in my stomach. The way it does when you realize the road you're driving isn't leading where you thought. I flipped another page, then another. The repetition never broke. Something slipped free from the folder and fluttered to the floor. I bent to retrieve it and found a photograph. Sepia, edges crumbling. It showed a cabin clinging to a bald slope of dirt. No trees, no grass, just clay and stone. 5 figures stood in front. They weren't smiling, but they weren't blank either. Their faces looked caught mid-breath, as though someone had startled them. One man's face rooted me to the spot, his jawline, his brow. It looked exactly like Sheriff Howard, the same man who parked outside the diner every morning sipping coffee, the same man who was easily in his 70s now. But this picture had to be nearly 90 years old. On the back, in cramped handwriting, was a note. Returned again, August 1936. The words prickled across my skin. Returned again. I slid the photo onto the table, meaning to push it aside, but my eyes kept snagging on it. When I finally forced myself to look back at the folder, the map I'd been studying was gone, vanished. In its place lay a different ledger altogether, spine cracked, pages fanned open as if it had been there the whole time. The room felt colder. My fingers shook when I reached for the thermos. It tipped and rolled, thudding onto the tile. That was when I realized I wasn't alone. At the far end of the corridor, just beyond the threshold of the archive door, stood a figure. A woman, back turned, hair pinned in a style no one wore anymore. Her dress was pale, patterned with rows of dark stitches. She didn't move, didn't sway, didn't breathe. For a moment I thought maybe she was a mannequin left from some historical display. But when I whispered, "Ma'am," her head twitched upward. The side of her cheek caught the light and I saw skin scraped raw, patches missing like old wallpaper peeled to plaster. I staggered back. She slid, not walked, behind a filing cabinet. I rushed after her, boots clattering the tile. But when I reached the spot, she was gone. No footsteps, no rustle, only the faint smell of something sweet rotting in water. My instincts screamed to get out. I grabbed the photo in my bag, bolted up the corridor. The fluorescent bulbs buzzed overhead like hornets. When I reached the lobby, the desk was empty. Mrs. Avery hadn't returned. My reflection in the glass door looked pale and unfamiliar. I shoved outside into sunlight that should have been comforting but felt washed out. Too bright, as though the color had been bled from the world. Back in the car, I gripped the wheel and forced myself to breathe. I looked up just once at the annex windows. On the second floor, behind the glass of the archive room, stood a figure in my chair. Perfectly still, watching. I told myself it was just a reflection, a trick of angle. But my chest wouldn't unclench. I turned the ignition and sped home without stopping, gas needle kissing empty. That afternoon, I carried the photograph behind my house to the fire barrel. The edges curled the second the match touched. Ash flaked upward on the breeze. I half expected the image to resist, but it burned fast, almost eager, until nothing remained but gray dust clinging to my palms. I thought that was the end of it. For a few days I managed to believe it was. Then came the dreams. At night I found myself standing on that clay slope, the cabin looming in shadow. The 5 figures watched me without blinking. Sometimes the sheriff's face was among them. Sometimes it was mine. When I woke, my throat tasted of dust and ash. The worst came a week later. I was shelving books in my apartment when I heard it. A flat scrape across the floorboards. The same sound my shoes had made in the archive hallway. Slow, steady, dragging, I froze. The air cooled around my ankles, carrying that faint sweet rot smell. From the corner of my eye, I saw a woman's shape slip behind my bookshelf, gliding instead of walking. I spun, heart hammering. No one was there, but when I lifted the curtain, I swore I saw the courthouse annex across the street, though my apartment was miles away from town. And in the upstairs window, a figure leaned forward, watching. I don't go back to the archives anymore. I told the Historical Society I quit, made up some excuse about better opportunities. But sometimes driving through town, I catch Sheriff Howard watching me too long. His eyes linger like he recognizes me from somewhere he shouldn't. And every so often, when the night is still, I hear that scrape again. As if the woman from the corridor has followed me home, patient as time, waiting for me to return what I never should have touched. I was 34 the first time I realized Chestnut Hollow wasn't like other places. I wasn't a local, just a part-time surveyor working out of Roane County. I'd been sent down there because nobody else wanted to waste their Saturday verifying property lines for land that hadn't changed hands since the 1950s. For me, it was just another paycheck, another excuse to rack up mileage on the county truck. I had no family in the area. No childhood memories tied to those ridges. I came in thinking it would be boring, routine, and quiet. That morning, I parked along a gravel pull-off near an old clapboard church that leaned against itself like a drunk. The place hadn't hosted a service in decades, but someone had propped the door shut with a board and painted a cross on the siding as if to remind passers-by what it used to be. Beyond the church stretched a dirt lane that led deeper into the hollow. According to the maps, it should have ended at a creek bed. According to the clerk who gave me the assignment, it didn't always stay put. I thought she was joking. Roads don't move. I started down that lane with a thermos of lukewarm coffee and a bundle of rolled plats under my arm. The air was damp, not the refreshing kind of damp, but the heavy, soaked into your bones kind that made you want to stretch your shoulders constantly. The ridges around the hollow were so steep they blocked out most of the morning light. You could tell time had no business here. The sun barely cleared the ridge by noon, and by dusk you were already swallowed in shadow. About 50 yards in, I stopped dead. The road was wrong. The county plat showed a straight line, clear as a ruler's edge. But what lay in front of me curved, bent lazily to the right like a snake adjusting itself in the grass. The bend wasn't on the map. At first, I thought maybe a storm had washed part of it out, and locals had carved a detour. But when I knelt and ran my fingers across the edge where the gravel met the grass, it was seamless. No fresh tire marks, no sign of disturbance. Just a road that looked like it had always been there, except yesterday it hadn't. I tried not to think too hard. I made a note in my ledger. Discrepancy in line survey. Verify with aerials. Practical explanation, I told myself. That was always the safest lie. By the time I reached the creek, the silence had thickened. No birdsong, no insects, just the soft hiss of water trickling over stone. I finished my notes, turned back toward the church, and almost convinced myself the bend hadn't been real. That night, lodged in a rented room above a feed store in town, I woke to a sound at the window. Tap, pause, tap, tap. My room was on the second floor, the wall facing the hillside. No balcony. Nothing outside but open air and tree branches too far to reach the glass. I froze, counting seconds. 3 knocks. Then nothing. I forced myself to the window, palms sweating, chest tight. My own reflection stared back. Hair a mess, skin pale in the moonlight. Beyond it, nothing moved. No raccoons, no stray branches, just the slope, still and dark. I told myself I was overtired, crawled back into bed and stayed awake until dawn bled pale over the ridge. When I returned to the hollow the next day, the road had shifted again. This time the bend veered wide, cutting toward the tree line, as if pointing me somewhere. The gravel crunched under my boots. My gut told me to turn around, but curiosity dragged me forward. The air smelled different, sweet and rotting like fruit left too long in water. I followed the curve until it ended at a patch of thin pines I hadn't seen before. At the base of one tree sat a wooden crate, half buried in leaves. The lid wasn't nailed, just resting in place. Against my better judgment, I lifted it. Inside were old papers curled from damp, property deeds, brittle and yellow, all stamped with the same parcel number, 112C. The same number scribbled across the surveyor plats I'd been working through. Each deed bore a different family name. Each was signed decades apart, but the land designation never changed. I shoved the papers back, heart thudding, and stumbled toward the church. By the time I reached the pull-off, sweat clung cold against my neck. I drove straight back to town without stopping. That evening I tried calling a colleague to ask if she'd heard of 112C. The phone rang once before the line dissolved into static. Not the fuzzy kind you can almost make sense of. The kind that burrows into your ears and rattles your teeth. I slammed the receiver down, stood in my rented kitchen with my hand still on the cord, and told myself I wouldn't go back. But I did. The following morning, I walked into the courthouse annex to cross-check the parcel records. The clerk's desk was empty. Downstairs in the archives, the air was colder than before. I found the right cabinet, yanked it open, and froze. The ledger on the shelf looked wrong. It was swollen. Its spine bowed like it had been soaked. I dragged it to a table and cracked it open. The first few pages were dry, but deeper in, the paper was damp, clinging together. And when I pried them apart, my fingertips came away stained with something reddish-brown. It smelled sharp, metallic, blood. I shoved the ledger back, wiped my hands on my jeans, and backed out of the room. My footsteps echoed too loud, and in that echo I thought I heard another set of steps, half a beat behind mine. At the top of the stairs stood a woman. Her back was to me, hair pinned in an old-fashioned bun, dress stitched in rows that looked hand-sewn. She didn't move when I whispered, "Ma'am." She only lifted her chin slightly, revealing skin raw and ragged along her jaw. My throat tightened. She slid behind a filing cabinet without a sound. When I rushed forward, she was gone. The air smelled faintly of that same sweet rot. That night, back in my rented room, I dreamed of the road. Not the way it looked now, but the way it kept bending, curling into the trees, pointing toward something buried. In the dream, I followed it to a house perched on bare clay. 5 figures stood outside, unsmiling, caught mid-thought. One face looked familiar. Sheriff Holden, the man who sat outside the diner every morning sipping coffee. But the dream house looked like it belonged in the 1930s. I woke drenched in sweat. On the table beside the bed lay a photograph I hadn't brought with me. The same house from my dream. The same 5 figures. On the back, returned again, September 1932. I burned it in the feed store's rusted barrel. Watched the edges curl to ash. But even then, I knew it wasn't gone. By midweek, I couldn't concentrate. Every time I looked out the window, I swore the road outside town had shifted again. At night, the knocks at the glass returned. Boone, the landlord's old hound, whined low in his throat and refused to come near my door. On Thursday, I drove back to the hollow one last time. The road bent wide now, leading to a slope of raw clay I hadn't seen before. At the top stood the cabin from the photograph. It leaned forward like it had been waiting. I didn't go inside. I didn't have to. The door creaked, and from the darkness a voice drifted out, patient, muffled, as though it had been waiting decades to be heard. "You're late," it said. I dropped the plats and bolted back down the hill, lungs burning. I agreed to help with that run up Deadwood Ridge, and it still feels like the last decision I ever made with my own good sense. By day, I worked nights as the custodian at Carter's Switch High, mopping hallways, fixing broken locks. replacing filters no one else bothered with. But money was tight after my divorce, and the school board only gave me 29 hours a week to avoid paying benefits. So when my cousin Ellis asked if I could haul a load of fittings and pipe up to the Marrow house for a little under-the-table cash, told him yes before I thought it through. Ellis ran maintenance for half the county. He was the type of man who could fix your tractor and your roof in the same afternoon, and he had a way of making you feel foolish if you said no to him. "It's just a delivery," he said. "Nothing but a crate, and you're the only one with a truck that'll hold together on that grade." I'd heard of the Marrow house, of course. Everybody in Carter's Switch had. Folks said it was the oldest frame house left standing in the valley, older even than the courthouse. People joked about it the way they joke about graves, half nervous, half reverent. You'd hear things like, "Don't rent the Marrow house unless you want to get spit back out by spring." People moved in and out so often it was like the place rejected them, like the land wouldn't digest whoever stayed too long. Nobody ever fixed the porch. Nobody ever cut the weeds. And yet, the deed kept turning up in the courthouse drawer like it had a mind to renew itself. By the time I loaded the crate into the bed of my truck, the air had that brittle edge that comes in late October, right before frost. The sun was sliding behind Deadwood Ridge, the kind of slow crawl that made every tree trunk look longer than it was. I told myself I'd be up and back before the last light died. But deep down, I knew that ridge had its own clock. The first stretch of road was gravel, fine enough. Then it narrowed into twin ruts carved so deep I felt the axle scrape now and then. The ridge rose ahead of me, tree line thick with pine and oak. The canopy blocked what little sun remained, and the cab of the truck dimmed like someone had thrown a cloth over it. Halfway up, I passed the old cemetery. A handful of stones leaned into the weeds, their faces sanded blank by wind. Someone had left a kerosene lantern burning at the gate. No house for miles, no footprints on the path. The flame bent as I rolled past, and for a second I swore it bent toward me like it was watching. I eased off the gas when I saw the prints. Bare feet, narrow, deep in the damp earth, weaving from ditch to ditch like whoever left them couldn't make up their mind where to walk. No shoe tread, no scuffs. Just hail to, hail to. They disappeared into the woods and didn't return. I should have turned back. I almost did, but Ellis had trusted me with the job, and I didn't want to face him with nothing but excuses. So I shifted down and let the truck crawl the last half mile. The Marrow house rose out of the trees like something dredged from the earth instead of built. 2 stories, siding gray as bone, porch slumping toward the ground. A chimney leaned outward as if it wanted to get away. No car in the drive, no smoke from the flue. The windows were bare, no curtains, no glass in some. I killed the engine and sat a long moment listening to the motor tick. The crate in the back seemed heavier than it had before. My heart kept tripping over itself, speeding and stalling like it couldn't decide which way to go. Finally I got out, grabbed the crate with both arms just to feel something solid, and made for the porch. The boards bowed under my weight. My boots pressed dust from cracks that hadn't been stepped on in years. I reached the door, raised my hand to knock, then froze. I hadn't heard anything, but I felt it. That sense of being noticed, of eyes on my back. I knocked anyway. The sound echoed through the frame like striking a drum. No reply. I called out that I had a delivery. Silence, heavy enough to make the hair on my neck prickle. Then it came, a scrape upstairs. Slow, deliberate, heavy. Something being dragged across the floor. I held my breath, waiting for it to stop. It didn't. The sound traveled forward toward the front of the house until it hovered just above where I stood. My mouth was dry as ash. My mind scrambled for excuses. Old furniture settling, wind through the rafters. But the rhythm was too steady. I backed off the porch, heart rattling, and circled toward the side windows. A few were cracked open. I cupped my hands and peered inside. Nothing. No furniture, no curtains. Bare walls, wallpaper slouching in strips. Just emptiness. That's when I noticed the holes. 6 of them lined along the foundation. Shallow, maybe a foot deep each. Perfectly round. The soil at the bottom dark and damp. Not fresh graves, but practice. As though someone had been rehearsing the same motion. Digging the same hole again and again until they got it right. I swallowed hard. Looked back up at the house. Something flickered in the upstairs window. Not the whole face, just a slice, forehead to chin. The skin pale like it had never felt sun. The eyes unblinking, fixed straight on me. "I'm just dropping this off," I called, voice cracking. The face didn't move. The mouth was a tight seam. I set the crate on the porch and stepped backward, hands trembling. My palm touched the cold steel of the truck handle. That's when I heard it. "You should check the mouth." The words came flat, corroded, like iron dragged over stone. No rise, no fall. Just a command stated as fact. My scalp prickled. I turned, but the window was empty. The face was gone. I knew better, I did. But something pulled me. Some gnawing need to see, to know whether it was all just rumor and rot. I circled the house until I found the cellar doors. Old boards swelled with damp, latch rusted near through. I pulled, and the metal crumbled in my hand. Cold air rose out, thick with the stink of soil gone sour. The kind of smell you get when you leave a sponge in dirty water. I forced myself down the steps, one hand braced against stone. The cellar wasn't finished. Walls half stone, half clay, bleeding through. At the far end, the earth sloped down into shadow. A bundle lay in the corner, cloth piled like forgotten laundry. My chest eased a little until the bundle moved, arms uncoiled, long, too smooth, bending in ways they shouldn't. The head lifted. Pale eyes caught mine, wide and still. It was the same face from the window. No blink, no breath. Just the weight of its stare pinning me in place. It didn't open its mouth. But the voice came again, rattling through the walls, through the soil, through me. "Help me." I stumbled backward, heel slipping on the stone. My shoulders slammed into the wall. Somehow I caught the door frame and hauled myself up the steps. I shoved the doors shut and threw the latch, even though it was nothing but rust. I didn't look back at the windows. I didn't pause on the porch. I crossed the yard with my heart hammering and my lungs burning. By the time I slid into the cab, my hands shook so hard it took 3 tries to slot the key. The engine roared and I shot down the track, gravel spitting behind me. Halfway back, I pulled over, sat with my face pressed to the wheel, listening to the engine tick. My mind clawed for something normal, a squatter, a prank, an old hermit squatting in the place. But the voice hadn't. I bought the house in Split Ash Hollow, and I'd tell you it was a decision made out of optimism. But really, it was just desperation. Rent had been eating me alive in town, and the only properties I could afford were the ones everybody else turned their nose up at. When the agent mentioned an old one-bedroom cabin tucked behind a screen of crooked maples, I signed before I thought too hard. "Quiet spot," she said. Secluded. That word, secluded, sounded like relief at the time. No neighbors checking up on me. No landlords. Just space to breathe. The place wasn't much. Clapboard siding gone gray, porch half sinking, and a backyard that bled straight into the tree line. But it was mine outright. No loan, no landlord. Just me, a couple boxes of furniture, and my hound, Rufus. He was the kind of dog who looked half asleep even when he was barking. Big amber eyes that made him seem older than he was. The first few weeks were uneventful. I'd drive into Claybrook for my shifts at the gas station, come home after dark, cook whatever fit in a skillet, and sit on the porch with Rufus at my feet. Crickets and creek song filled the nights. I even started to believe the bad reputation was just town gossip. The sort of stories people tell to make themselves feel wiser for avoiding places like mine. The first sign came on a brittle cold morning in late September. I decided to walk the back acre and see if the shed near the fence line could be salvaged for storage. Rufus trailed at my side, nails clicking over frosted grass until we got halfway across the yard. Then he stopped dead, hackles lifted, tail tucked, a low moan rumbling out of his throat. I tugged the leash. He didn't move. "Come on," I coaxed, trying to keep my voice light. His whole body trembled like a branch in a storm. I'd never seen him act like that. I should have turned back. Instead, I unclipped the leash and let him retreat while I went on alone. Up close, the shed looked more like a leaning crate than a building. Roof sagging, boards split, the padlock on the door orange with rust. I wrapped my hand around it, expecting it to hold. It snapped off clean, light as chalk in my palm, like someone had already weakened it for me. The air inside was thick and sour. A ring of flat stones sat perfectly centered on the dirt floor. Each one had a smear across the top, dark and greasy, like a thumb had pressed something tar-like into it. No footprints in the dust, no animal scat, nothing but my own tracks. I backed out, heart thudding, dropped the useless lock in the weeds, and shut the door tight. The walk back felt twice as long as it should have, like the yard had stretched behind me. That night, Rufus wouldn't settle. He pressed himself to the front door, body stiff, ears pinned. Around midnight, he let out a growl that turned into a whimper. I switched on the porch light. The yard looked empty at first, just frost glittering under the maples. Then something slid between the trees at the edge of the clearing. Tall, too tall. It moved like it already knew every root and dip in the ground. It reached the shed, braced one long arm against the wood, and stilled. Couldn't see its face, only the suggestion of fingers. Long, spindled things splayed against the siding. "You okay out there?" I called, though my voice cracked. The figure tilted its head. Then, deliberate as a neighbor on his way to greet me, it raised one hand and waved. A slow, almost friendly wave. My chest went cold. I shut the door, locked every bolt, and sat on the floor with Rufus pressed against my legs until morning. When daylight came, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. A trick of light, a deer rearing, something simple. But when I checked the frost near the shed, I found prints. Bare feet, each one longer than my boot by half. Toes perfectly clear, pressed deep as if the ground had softened just for them. I called Deputy Garth, who'd grown up in Split Ash Hollow before moving to town. He came chewing on a toothpick, trying to look unconcerned. When he crouched to study the prints, I saw his jaw tighten. "Could be a drifter," he muttered. "Hermit living rough? Barefoot in this cold?" He didn't answer. Just handed me a card with the non-emergency number and said to call if it came back. The next morning, I found a cairn of pebbles stacked neatly on the shed threshold. The day after that, a strip of bark laid in the exact center of my porch. On the third morning, a loop of twine tied in a knot I didn't recognize. I called Garth twice. "Left voicemails?" The reply. Rufus refused to leave the porch after dark. Even in daylight, he'd dash out to relieve himself and dart back, claws scrabbling on the boards. I started feeling like the house itself was shrinking, pressing me against the windows. Then came the voice. It was just after 3 in the morning when I woke to a rhythm outside. Not footsteps, not tapping, but a measured chant. Low, steady, almost gentle. The words were blurred, thick as if spoken through water. But the cadence never broke. I peeled back the curtain with shaking hands. The figure stood in the yard, taller than the porch roof, draped in something shapeless. Its head was cocked to one side, listening. The chant rolled on, patient and endless. I let the curtain fall. Instantly, the voice stopped. The silence that followed was so sudden it felt like pressure in my ears. At first light, I found 7 stones lined across the porch, each smeared with that same dark grease. Twine wrapped the doorknob in a knot so complicated it looked woven. That was the moment I decided I couldn't last another night. I stuffed clothes into a duffel, packed Rufus's food, and pulled cash from the coffee tin. While hauling the bag to the truck, I felt the air shift. Everything went still. Not the ordinary stillness of early morning, but a hush so deep it pressed into my skin. I turned. It was by the shed again. Same towering shape, same slow tilt of the head. For the first time, I thought I could make out the surface of its face, pale as stone, smooth as if it hadn't been carved all the way. Not unfinished. Waiting. I drove until the ridge was behind me, until Rufus stopped trembling in the passenger seat. I stayed with my sister in Ashford for 3 months, never once setting foot back in Split Ash Hollow. I let the realtor handle the sale. Didn't even pack the rest of my things, the woman who bought the place called me weeks later. Her voice shook as she said, "The shed. There was something standing in the yard last night. Tall, silent, watching." I hung up. The locals call it the Watcher of Split Ash Hollow. They say some land doesn't let go of the people who try to claim it. It remembers, it waits, and when you leave, it follows. Some nights now, even 2 counties away, Rufus will shiver at the front door. And sometimes, if I listen past the hum of traffic, I swear I can hear it. Low, rhythmic, careful. chanting for me to come back. I was 35 when I took the job at the courier depot on the far side of Pine Hollow. It wasn't glamorous work. Long days sorting letters, hauling crates, stamping slips until my hand cramped. But it was steady, and in a county like ours, steady counted for something. My divorce had just finalized. My apartment lease was ending, and the depot had a small rental cabin attached for overnight clerks. It seemed like the easiest solution. The cabin was tucked into the hillside behind the depot, screened off by a row of thin birches. The roof sagged a little, and the window frames needed paint. But after years of sharing walls with neighbors who argued at 2 in the morning, the quiet felt like a blessing. Rufus, my old beagle mix, settled in faster than I did. He'd sprawl belly up in front of the wood stove, his paws twitching like he was running in his dreams, while I sat at the kitchen table filling out root logs by lamplight. For the first month, nothing unusual happened. My shifts were predictable, 7 to 4, Monday through Friday. I'd stamp parcels, weigh envelopes, answer the same handful of questions about money orders. The depot itself was plain concrete and fluorescent lights, the kind of place where time felt thin, stretched too far. Then one Monday morning in late October, I found something wedged in the intake slot. It was a small parcel, no bigger than a shoebox, but it had been crammed in so tightly it bent the flap of the metal bin. I tugged it loose and the cardboard left a damp streak across my palm. At first I thought it was just weather damage. Packages get rained on all the time. But the paper didn't feel like water had touched it. The surface was puckered in odd rings, like it had been pressed against wet cloth and then left to dry crooked. The label was little more than a gray blur. No return address, no postage, just a few half-visible scratches of ink that might once have been letters. I figured it was a prank. Teenagers in Pine Hollow had too much time and too little sense. We'd find frogs in mailboxes, glue on the drop box handle, that sort of thing. I set the parcel on the back counter, planning to open it after the morning rush. Hours passed in the familiar blur of paperwork and chatter. By 4 o'clock, the depot was empty, the last customer gone, and the only sounds left were the HVAC rattling and Rufus snoring on his blanket by the desk. That was when I looked at the package again. It had left a faint dark patch on the counter, almost like oil, and the cardboard looked close to splitting at the seams. A sour smell clung to it, faint like damp wood, but enough to make the back of my throat itch. I thought about calling the sheriff's office, but the idea of explaining that I was afraid of a soggy box felt humiliating. So instead I carried it to the workbench, grabbed a knife and slit the tape. Inside was a bundle of white cloth tied with fraying twine. The fabric was blotched with irregular brown stains. My hands prickled cold as I worked the knots loose. The cloth folded back to reveal a wooden figure, roughly a foot long, carved in a crude human shape. Arms, legs, head, all the same thickness like someone had whittled it without care. Where the face should have been, 3 shallow grooves had been burned into the wood. 2 slanted downward where eyes should be, one curling down like a slack mouth. It looked less like a face than a mask trying to scream. I set it down hard. My palms tingled as if I'd grabbed a live wire. For a moment I couldn't breathe right. The air in the depot seemed to weigh more than it had a minute ago. I told myself it was just somebody's weird craft project, some backwoods artist leaving junk around to spook people. I shoved the figure into the supply room, wedging it behind a stack of boxes, and returned to the desk to type up an incident report. I hadn't gotten 3 sentences in when I heard it. 3 dull knocks on the front counter. I froze, then stood slowly, expecting to see a kid crouched and grinning, waiting for me to yell. But the lobby was empty. The glass door was shut, the lot outside barren. Even Rufus hadn't stirred. I checked the corners, behind the bins, even under the counter. Nothing. When I returned to the workbench, the figure was gone. For a moment, I just stood there, stomach boiling, trying to convince myself I'd misplaced it. But I knew exactly where I'd left it. The stack of boxes hadn't shifted. The space was empty. That night I drove the long way home, headlights jittering across broken fences. The cabin felt smaller than usual, pressing in on me. I bolted the doors, left the lamp burning, and still barely slept. At 2 in the morning, I woke to a sound. Not knocking this time, but tapping, measured, patient, against my bedroom door. 3 taps, a pause, then 3 more. Rufus whined low in his throat. My chest felt hollow. I forced myself to the door and cracked it open. The hallway was empty, but leaning neatly against the wall was the wooden figure. Its burned grooves faced upward, blank and waiting. I didn't touch it. I closed the door and locked it. I sat awake until the sky lightened and the birds began to stir. At dawn, I carried the figure outside, wrapped in an old towel. The earth behind the shed was still soft from last week's rain. I dug until the hole came up past my knees, dropped the figure in, and packed the clay over it with both hands until my knuckles bled. I told myself it was over. But 2 nights later, I woke again. Not to tapping this time, but to a voice. It wasn't loud. It was careful, low and deliberate, repeating the same phrase over and over. The cadence was steady, but the words themselves were blurred, thick, like they were spoken through cloth. I pressed my ear to the wall. The voice came from outside, near the shed. Rufus whimpered and crawled under the bed. I didn't open the curtain. By morning, I almost convinced myself I'd dreamed it, until I went outside and found 7 small stones arranged in a perfect circle on the porch. Each one had a black smear across the top. I called the sheriff's office. Deputy Yates listened without interrupting, then said maybe some local kids were trying to scare me. He offered to drive by after dark, though he didn't sound like he meant it. That evening I stayed at my sister's place in town. When I returned the next morning, the circle of stones had been replaced with a bundle of twigs tied in a complicated knot. The knot looked deliberate, like it had taken patience to weave. After that, I stopped calling the sheriff. A week crawled by. Rufus refused to step off the porch at night. Even in daylight, he bolted back inside after doing his business. I started keeping the curtains closed, the lights low. Every time the floor creaked, I flinched. One night, near 3 a.m., I made the mistake of looking. I pulled the curtain back an inch and saw it. I was 29 when I first took the night records job at the small county health annex, out past Briar Ridge. Folks around here didn't even call it a clinic anymore. It was just the annex, as though giving it a proper name might accidentally remind people it was still open. It sat half forgotten at the edge of the hollow, down where the blacktop ended and the gravel turned mean. It wasn't the kind of job you bragged about, but I was broke and needed something steady after dropping out of school. My cousin Marcus told me the pay wasn't much, but the hours were quiet and nobody looked over your shoulder. That sounded like exactly what I needed. The annex itself was a squat brick rectangle with windows filmed over in dust, a roofline sagging so badly it made you wonder if the whole thing would fold in on itself come winter. If you drove past too quickly, you'd mistake it for another abandoned county building, one of the hundreds dotting this stretch of Appalachia like scars from a forgotten time. Inside, though, the place still hummed faintly. A couple of clerks worked daylight hours filing insurance paperwork, but nights were mine. I had one key and the run of the records basement. My task was simple: take the ancient cabinets full of patient ledgers and translate them into digital form. It wasn't glamorous, but the monotony had its own comfort. Most nights I'd put on a thermos of coffee, stack up folders, and lose myself in the rhythm of typing names, dates, procedures. You could almost forget how silent it was, how the air felt stale, like it had been trapped for years. One October evening, not long after the maples had turned the ridges a burning red, I was working through a row of binders labeled 1964-1969. The paper inside was brittle, some pages eaten through with mildew, others so faded the ink looked more like shadows than letters. Tucked behind a row of cracked blue folders, I noticed something that didn't belong. It was a narrow black ledger, the kind with a leatherette cover. Unlike everything else in the cabinet, it looked almost new. Smooth spine, no dust, corners crisp. When I touched it, I jerked my hand back. The surface was warm, as though it had been sitting near a radiator. There was no heat vent anywhere near that cabinet. I told myself I was imagining it, probably a trick of nerves. But when I finally pulled it free, I swear the temperature rose just enough to bead sweat at my hairline. The ledger opened with a stiff crack, like it didn't want to be touched. Inside, pages were filled with small, tidy handwriting and columns. Surnames jumped out at me right away. Blevins, Rourke, Doherty. Names I'd heard my grandmother whisper when she talked about old families. At first, each line looked ordinary. Name, date of intake, notes about disposition. Most entries ended with the phrase "released to kin." That made sense. People came into the annex for everything from fevers to births back when it was the only medical stop for 40 miles. But halfway down a page, my eye caught on something different. The surname Coulomb had been listed 7 times in a row, across nearly 20 years. And in the disposition column, instead of released, someone had written one word over and over: kept. Not printed neatly, but gouged. The word darkened until it cut through the paper, leaving tears that looked angry, almost violent. My throat tightened. I told myself it had to be shorthand for some medical category. An adoption code, something dull. But the longer I stared, the more it looked like obsession rather than notation. I flipped further ahead. More names, more normal dispositions, but at the back the pages went blank, except for one line stamped across every sheet in crooked block letters: "The root still grows." The phrase repeated a dozen times, each impression heavier than the last until the ink bled through. The air in the basement thickened. Felt like someone had stepped up behind me, leaning close enough to press a hand on my shoulder, though the room was empty. Then came the smell. Not mildew, not dust, but something wet and sour, like roots pulled from swamp mud, pungent and wrong. I pushed back from the desk so hard my chair squealed. The overhead fluorescence buzzed once, then dimmed. I closed the ledger fast, jamming it under a pile of folders. My pulse wouldn't slow down. I tried to steady my hands by typing notes into the computer, but every time I glanced up at the cabinets, I felt watched. It was close to midnight when I finally packed my bag. I told myself I'd make up the hours another time. I shut off the lights and climbed the creaking stairs back to the main floor. The night air outside was cool, sharp with wood smoke from distant chimneys. For a moment I felt relief, until I noticed the ground by my car. Someone had arranged 7 stones into a perfect circle in the gravel, each one smeared with a streak of dark soil. Rufus whined low in his throat when I pulled up at home, and I knew without touching the stones that whatever had been in that basement hadn't stayed behind. That night, sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the words stamped across those pages. Around 3 a.m., exhaustion dragged me under, and that was when the dream came. I was back in the annex hallway, only the fluorescence blazed so bright the walls seemed to vanish. The air felt syrupy, thick. At the end of the corridor stood a man in a black suit so soaked it dripped steadily onto the tiles. His hair was plastered to his skull. His back faced me. I tried to speak, but my throat locked. He turned. His face was pale to the point of translucence. Veins spidering blue beneath skin stretched thin. His mouth moved, but the words didn't come from him. They whispered directly behind my ear, low and cold. "You opened it." I woke tangled in damp sheets, lungs burning like I'd inhaled river water. The clock read 4:17. I couldn't shake the certainty that if I went back to sleep, something else would be waiting. By dawn, I decided the only way forward was to return the ledger to the cabinet and forget it, like putting a stone back in the earth. But when I arrived at the annex, my plan shattered. The cabinet was empty. The ledger was gone. In its place was a folded slip of paper. Across the front, in spidery ink, was my name. Inside, 3 words: "The root calls." My skin went clammy. I left the note on the desk, turned and walked out without shutting off a single light. I drove past Briar Ridge until the hollow gave way to flat fields. I didn't look in the rear view once. That night, though, in my own house, the air carried that same swamp-sour smell. And outside my window, in the frost of the yard, 7 stones gleamed in a circle, waiting. I never went back to the annex. I left the county within the month. I took a job cleaning out estate properties for the county. It wasn't glamorous work. Hauling boxes, sorting papers, sometimes finding things that should have been thrown away decades ago. But it paid better than my shifts at the diner, and it got me out of town. Most days that was reason enough. That week they'd sent me to clear the last of the Rankin house. The family had scattered years earlier, and the only thing left was a box of legal documents and a brass key. I wasn't supposed to keep anything, but no one else wanted to deal with it. I figured I'd drop it at the courthouse archives on my way home. The box sat on the passenger seat of my pickup all morning, taped shut and harmless looking, though I swear more than once I caught myself glancing at it like it might open itself. By the time I finished my run and stopped for gas, the sun had already dipped low behind the ridge. The shortest way back to my place was the state highway, but I wasn't ready to sit under bright lights and radio chatter just yet. My nerves were frayed, and the idea of the long way around, an old ridge road no one used unless they grew up around here, felt almost like comfort. My dad used to take it when I was a kid. He'd roll down the windows, point out where old mines had collapsed, where surveyors claimed the ground swallowed more than rock. I never knew if he was joking, or if it was just the kind of warning fathers handed down without explanation. The first mile felt ordinary. The road coiled around the hills like a ribbon laid down by hand. My headlights caught sagging fences, cedar posts eaten hollow by insects, and ditches so deep you had to straddle them or risk tearing your axle clean off. But after a while I realized nothing sounded right. The woods had gone mute. No insects, no distant barking dog, no hum of frogs in the marsh hollows. Just the hum of the engine and the faint click of my thumbnail against the steering wheel. My palms itched with sweat. The cab of the truck felt heavier than the air outside. Like the atmosphere had thickened. I kept telling myself it was just October settling in. But every curve in the road seemed to have shifted a little. Like someone had nudged the map while I wasn't looking. 2 miles up, I saw it. At first I thought it was a hunter stranded, as maybe waving for help. A tall outline on the shoulder, leaning slightly forward. I slowed the truck, headlights spilling across it. The shape was human enough, but the proportions were off. One shoulder rose higher than the other, and the head hung too low, like it was straining against its own weight. The figure didn't move. I coasted closer, squinting. The skin, if it was skin, looked pale enough to glow under the beams. No details, no hair, no eyes. Just a smooth expanse stretched over bone. My foot slipped from the gas. I gripped the wheel so tight my knuckles burned. For a second, the silence roared louder than any engine. The thing tilted its head, slow as a pendulum, as if it could hear me thinking. Every story I'd ever heard about the ridge came back at once. Not the quarry swallowing men, not the mines flooding, but the one my grandmother whispered when she wanted me home before dark. She called it the Seamless. Said it wandered roads no map could fix, listening for people who didn't belong. The figure raised an arm, but the limb bent in too many places. Shoulder, elbow, wrist, and another unnatural joint in between. The hand pointed directly at my windshield. I couldn't breathe. My chest locked. The world shrank to that one pale limb beckoning me forward. I pressed the gas, inching past it. My headlights dragged across the body. Even with the road narrowing, I didn't dare slow down. I just needed distance. But when I glanced in the mirror, my stomach turned. It was behind me, not running, not walking. Simply there, standing at the tailgate like it had blinked across the gravel. Its face leaned toward the glass, still featureless but beginning to split. A seam ran down the middle, quivering as though ready to open. I slammed the accelerator. The truck fishtailed, gravel spraying into the ditch. My headlights flickered once, twice. In the heartbeat of darkness between, I heard a scrape across the tailgate, metal on bone. When the beams snapped back, it had gained ground. Another step. Another inch of that seam pulling apart. I drove reckless, wheels slamming through potholes, shocks rattling. Every breath felt stolen. Branches lashed the sides, and I didn't even care if the paint came off. At the turn where the quarry road cut down toward the hollow, I slowed out of instinct. My father had always said you never stopped on that bend. The earth there didn't hold steady. It shifted like water under dirt. But I made the mistake of glancing at the mirror. It was waiting at the curve, as though it had arrived before me. Still pointing, still tilting its head in that unbearable way. The seam in its face split a fraction wider, and for the first time I heard something. Not a voice. Not words, a vibration. Low, bone-deep humming in the glass and in my teeth, as though the key in the box beside me was answering it. I gunned the engine and shot past, tires screeching. The smell of iron filled the cab, sharp and metallic. By the time I reached the Glenwood Bridge, my vision was swimming. The boards beneath the tires rattled like they'd snap in half. The headlights of another car appeared far down the main highway, unreal in their normalcy. I almost wept. When I finally coasted onto the asphalt, I pulled over, chest heaving, hands locked on the wheel. I told myself it was over, that the Seamless, if that's what it was, belonged to the ridge and would never cross into the open. But when I looked down at the box, the cardboard had bulged. The tape strained at the seams. I pressed a trembling hand against it. The brass key inside was warm, too warm, and faintly, unmistakably, it vibrated in time with that hum I'd heard when the thing pointed at me. I haven't taken that ridge road since. But sometimes, parked in my own driveway miles away, I'll glance at the rearview mirror before getting out of the truck. And in the reflection, just for an instant, I see a pale head tilt toward me, listening.